now. We're good. All right, cool. So listen, most people never met Jesus. I know that's not like you would know that if you thought about it for a second. Jesus was alive for 30 years, and that was 2,000 years ago, right? So 30 out of 2,000 is not a lot, and so obviously most people have not met Jesus of Nazareth, the carpenter who hangs out in the ancient world or whatever. But I think it's also important to say that most people who were alive during the 30 years he was alive didn't meet Jesus. The Bible sometimes makes it seem like everybody knows Jesus. Like everywhere he goes, people are like, "Oh, hey, it's that guy." Or, he has these, sermons with, feeds the 5,000 after this sermon and feeds the 4,000. He has these huge crowds, and everywhere he goes, like goes to the temple and everybody's listening. Like, it makes it seem like everybody knows Jesus. But the fact is, almost nobody knows Jesus. Like he has his disciples, and then he has, and I don't just mean like the 12. I mean like, there's dozens of those. But for the most part, nobody really knows Jesus. They don't like hang out with him. And even the people who see him in a crowd, like if you're in the 5,000, like you are one of the 5,000 that was fed, man, that's like just going to like a big concert, Like if you've got 5,000 people in a crowd and you go to see a show, it's not like, well, I know that guy or I know that girl who's singing. No, like you're one of the 5,000 who's hanging out in a crowd. You not like you guys hang out afterwards. And so it's really important for us to say this, that at the end of the day, almost everybody made their decisions about what they believed about Jesus based on what someone else said. They didn't make that decision based on firsthand knowledge, firsthand accounts, sitting down, having a meal, talking through issues. That's not it at all. A few, some, but for the vast majority, people made their decisions about who Jesus was based on what somebody else had told them. And sometimes that led to some good things, right? Like, one day Jesus talks to his close disciples that would become the apostles, and he says, "Hey, what is it that everybody's saying about me?" And, Peter ends up responding, "Hey, everybody thinks you're like one of the prophets, reincarnated. You're one of the reincarnated prophets," because apparently ancient Jewish people are cool with reincarnation. And so they're like, "Yeah, they think you're Elijah or you're this or you're that." And, sometimes people say he's John the Baptist. Like John the Baptist dies and then Jesus kind of picks up his ministry and people are like, "Oh, John the Baptist has been reincarnated in Jesus." That's weird, but it's also good, is what I'm saying. Right? People, a lot of times when people talked about Jesus, they would talk about like, oh, he performs miracles, or, he preaches unlike anybody else. He casts out demons. He does all these things. And so a lot of times people would believe in Jesus because they heard he did good things. But the problem with hearing things secondhand is it depends on who you're listening to. Because there's a lot of folks who say a lot of things about Jesus that aren't so good. Like there's this one time where Jesus goes and he's talking to this group of people, and they have a little bit of an argument, and they end up referring to the fact that he was an illegitimate child. Like, hey, you were born in sin. You don't know who your father is. Your mom was a sinner. Like, that didn't go well. Don't say things about people's moms. Ever. Okay? Don't do that. But Jesus didn't like it. Jesus didn't like that. But it was obviously that wasn't a positive thing. Like it's not like they're like, "Oh, you don't know who your dad is. High five." It was, you don't know who your dad is, which means you were born in sin, which means you're not somebody who should be teaching us. That piece of information had gone before Jesus. And so when Jesus shows up in a town, they know some things about him, and that's one of the things they know. Some stuff wasn't, even, so other things were just as kind of insidious and things like that, where it's like, hey, Jesus possessed by a demon, or Jesus possessed by Satan, or Jesus is, crazy. Like there's some people that looked at Jesus that just said, "Man, that dude is nuts." And so the fact is, in the ancient world, it really depended on who else you trusted. What else you trusted and why. It wasn't like, okay, you talk to Jesus and he convinces you. For the vast majority of people, like 99% of people, it was listening to the stories that other people have to say and then making your decision based on that. Now, sometimes the result of that is fantastic. And maybe the most famous story of that is about this a Roman centurion. Now, a Roman centurion is a commander of the Roman army, and the Roman centurion in this story, and also all of the Roman centurions, they were in Israel for not good reasons. They weren't there on holiday. They weren't there because they were visiting. They were there because they were oppressing the people. They were the hand of Rome. They were the tip of the spear of Rome. They were there to keep control and make sure that everything went the way that Rome wanted it to go. Which means most of the time people don't like the Roman soldiers and don't like the Roman commanders and don't like the Romans at all. Almost everybody just hates these people. And that's why there's all these violence, bloodshed, there's a war 30 years after Jesus, all of that. Well, this particular guy was actually really nice. He was a good guy. He was a good dude. He I don't know what it was. I don't know exactly, the circumstance. We're not told a lot, but we're told that when he came to Israel and he, set up camp and did his job, that he was nice. That he went out of his way to care about the Jewish people. That it was so far that the Jewish people actually said, this guy loves us. He cares about us. And he proved it because they needed a synagogue built where he was set up. And he said, that's no problem. We got plenty of money. And he built a synagogue for the Jewish people. He was that kind of a guy, kind of proving that, you shouldn't be judging people on where they come from or what nation or what political affiliation, because everybody's, a special snowflake. Everybody is kind of themselves. And so this guy, while most Romans were not good, this guy was extremely, extremely good. And then he had a problem. He had this slave that he absolutely loved. And this slave was dying. And so he went to the people. He said, hey, what can we do? And the people said, well, look, we've heard that this Jesus guy can heal people. And he's like, well, tell me more about him. And they told him everything they knew about Jesus. And he said, great, that guy sounds awesome. Tell you what, could a few of you guys go find him and ask him to heal my servant, my slave? And they said, great, it's the least we can do. We're friends, we get along. And so this group of Jewish people go to Jesus and they meet Jesus. Hey, look, we've got this Roman centurion. He has this slave he absolutely loves. The guy's going to die. He has requested that you help him. And Jesus says, yeah, that sounds like the thing I do. I'm Jesus. I heal people. It's kind of my thing. And so he said, oh, cool, let's go meet him. Let's go see him. And let's go do this miracle. So the Jewish people and the Roman centurion kind of go to meet Jesus. And on the way, something kind of amazing happens. On the way, Jesus and these Jewish folks are met by some messengers from the Roman centurion who have a message, who are like, hey, you misunderstood. I didn't mean for you to come meet me. He says, I'm not, if what you say, if what's true about you, what people say about you is true, I am not worthy to hang out with you, okay? Like, I know who I am. I know who you are. So don't come visit me. I don't even want to meet you. But I know that as a commander, if I tell somebody to do something, that they'll go do it. That's how this works. It's like a chain of command. My assumption is if you just say you want my servant healed, then it'll happen. So could you just do that? And Jesus just absolutely loved this. He was like, man, it turns out he's like, look, I have not heard of that kind of faith in anywhere in Israel. I have not met. And by the way, sometimes when this story is told, people kind of use it as a time to dog on the Jewish people and talk about how they didn't have great faith. No, when Jesus says like the great faith of the Jews, he's referring to like Peter and John and Andrew and, the people who literally started the church. They had really amazing faith, but this guy's faith was bigger. Because he was willing to put his faith in Jesus based on what he had heard without even meeting Jesus. He had the opportunity to meet Jesus. And he said, no, that's not what I need. And so Jesus does, great, no problem. Heals the guy's son, and the two never meet. Jesus says this example of incredible, amazing faith. It's a man he never meets. And they just go about their business. Now, that's a really amazing story of faith, of Christ, of everything else. And it really shows us the way most of this works. Most people, they didn't meet Jesus. Most people just heard about Jesus and made their decision one way or the other. So, that's a good story. But not also good. And as it turns out, there is actually one of the most famous stories of Jesus, one of the most famous events of Jesus is a story that's sort of the opposite of that story with the Roman centurion. And it all has to do with the way that the temple was structured. Now, the temple is, we sometimes think there's lots of temples. It's one of those things I always make. I get the word like synagogue and temple confused. And I think, oh, there's lots of temples. No, there's one temple, and it's in Jerusalem. And the temple, that is it's the center of Jewish worship. It's where there were sacrifices. It's where, people would worship, where people would go. It was it was a place where you would want to go as often as possible. But for some people, that was just like once in a lifetime. Like just for some folks, they would go, like one time their whole life. They would save up their money. They would travel. Traveling's hard. Traveling's hard now, but traveling is hard without planes and cars and stuff. And so, it would be a difficult thing to make like a huge trek to go to Jerusalem and go. So the temple was one of those places where you would go as often as you could, but for much of the ancient Jewish world, it was not a really all that accessible thing for you. It was something you looked forward to. It was something you really valued. It was sacred. It was holy. It was set apart. And all that's good. But in the days of Jesus, some things had happened. And what happened was money and religion had gotten married. And I got to tell you, that's never good. It's just never good. And I'm not going to make fun of anybody. I often have. But look, when you marry faith and money, it's never good. And the Jewish people, they did it in a way that was really rather unique. There's two real mechanisms that they made money in the temple off of the people. Okay? The first mechanism was you can't just sacrifice any old animal. And so that's true according to the law, but it just so happens to be, I know it's going to shock you, that the only animals that were actually okay to be sacrificed happened to be at the temple for sale. I know. What a coincidence. What a coincidence that the animal you brought doesn't work. But the one over there you can buy, it just happens to work. I know. What a crazy world. And so people would go and, they may not even know it. Like they may have traveled like all this huge distance, like bringing their own animal, which, traveling is hard enough, but you travel with animals. It's tough, And so they get there and then they're told, oh, that animal won't work. You need to buy this one. And that's kind of how that works. And so that's difficult. But on top of that, there's a second mechanism, because it's not just about buying the animals. It's actually also about the kind of money you used. As it turns out, there's all sorts of... It's just hard for us to understand because, we live in one country with what... In the ancient world, everybody spoke like 3 languages. Like, at least. Like, out of the womb, you come out speaking 3 languages because there's 3 languages everywhere you go. And when I say 3, I mean, it just depends on where you go. There could be 5, 6, 7. They just all had all kinds of different languages. They had those languages because they had those cultures. And those cultures, they all liked their own coins. The Romans don't want money that isn't Roman money. And other people don't want Roman money because they're not Roman. And everybody, they're just printing their own things, right? Like they're making their own coins. And so the temple had their own coins. And they would change the coins for a price into their coins. So you come with Roman coins or Jewish coins or whatever, you bring your coins and no, we don't take that. We need the temple coins, right? And then we'll do it at, 25% markup. And then you'll do that so you can go buy an animal that you think you don't even need. And that's what it was. You had money changers and you had animals. So imagine if you came to church, like you showed up to church today, and like there was just barnyard animals in the lobby, just like donkeys and chickens and just all sorts of animals. And we're like, all right, we're gonna kill these guys, okay? But you gotta buy it, and also American dollars don't work, okay? But for 2 of your American dollars, I'll give you an ACC dollar. And this is how this works. You can imagine how infuriating that is. You can especially imagine how infuriating that is if this was a once-in-a-lifetime trip that you brought your family with it, right? I always make the joke, I hate repeating jokes, but it's the best one. Like, this is a lot like going to Disney. Like, you get to Disney and you're like, wait, how much is parking? Wait, how much is a bottle of water? Wait, are you serious? Like, the hotel is what? My kids need mouse ears? That's $29? It's not anything. It's cardboard. What are we doing here? Like, it's sort of like going somewhere to realize that there's just all sorts of ancillary things. The temple was a place that people would get to and realize there's all sorts of ancillary costs. Now, look, biblical scholars, religious people, look, they argue about whether there was true corruption going on, like the people were stealing, like charging too much. That's, that's one level. And other people just say, no, there wasn't corruption. It's just the system just demanded money. It doesn't matter, okay? Because every human person that's ever existed hates being hassled for money. We hate it. We all, it's just terrible. And so, like the day before Thanksgiving, and you go to Walmart, and like you park a mile and a half away, and you go in, and like it's the year of giving thanks, and so everyone is frowning. And you go in, and like everybody's just miserable because every person in that room is like, well, I messed up. I should have done my shopping 3 days ago, but I didn't. And so everyone is just angry because it costs more, and that's what the temple was. This place that was supposed to be a place of worship, a place of connecting to God, a place that was sacred and holy, was a place where everybody was angry. And when I say everybody, I mean the everybody who can afford to be there. Because there's two groups of people. There's the people that are there and angry, and then there's the people who can't afford to be there at all. And so that's the temple. And so it was a place that was infuriating, and it was excluding people. It was a place that was, you have all these barriers between people and God. The temple was meant to be a place where people could meet God. And instead, the temple was a place where people wanted to meet God, but there was stuff in the way that wouldn't let them meet God. And so Jesus sees this. And Jesus doesn't like it. He to quote the Michael Jordan meme, he took that personally. So he made a whip by hand because Jesus is crafty. He's crafty. He made himself a whip, and he went into the temple, and with that whip, he drove out all of the animals. He gets to the table to the money changers. He picks those things up and throws them, turning over the temple. He is screaming Bible verses from the Old Testament, like the scary ones. And he the scariest dude you've ever seen. It just cleans everybody out. The money changers are gone. The animals are gone. And he just freaks out. We call this the cleansing of the temple. It's funny, we give very good names to Jesus just freaking out. What's amazing about this story is that Jesus, he's there, and there's a temple guard, like the police are there, and they're guarding everything, and they watch him do it, and for whatever reason, they're like, well, we're not getting in the middle of this. And it's not just that, because on holidays, the temple guard, because there's more people on holidays, you would have Roman soldiers be there too. And what's funny is this happens at a Passover. Passover being the biggest holiday for the Jews, meaning you have lots of Roman soldiers. And the Roman soldiers watch what's happening. And they say, yeah, we're not getting in the middle of that either. Jesus was so intimidating He was so scary, it seems, that the temple guard and the Romans just looked at him and said, well, that's not us. We're not. It seems like that's going to be a bad day if we go try to stop him. It's not quite the picture of Jesus with the lamb or like the senior picture. I love Jesus' senior picture. It's in all the old churches. He's looking this way. Something over here. Anyway. Jesus was terrifying is the point. As an aside, it's not really all that important, but it's really important that we understand that in the ancient world, everybody had to be tough. Like there's bandits and stuff. Like there's like bears. This is a brutal world. Nobody looked like me back then. These guys were all actually men. They were actually tough. Jesus was tough as nails, guys, and it's really important that we understand that Jesus is tough as nails, only for how we picture things. Anyway. So Jesus cleanses the temple, and then we read an interesting thing. Now, this is going to become important that all four gospel writers record this story. They tell us that this happened. But one of them, Mark, gives us a detail that we need to read. This is what we read in Mark chapter 11. It's actually the second verse I was supposed to read. I didn't read the first verse because I'm bad at my job. So the second one, this is what we read in the gospel according to Mark. It says, when the leading priests and teachers of religious law heard what Jesus had done, they began planning how to kill him. But they were afraid of him because the people were so amazed at his teaching. Okay, so that's why it's in this series. We've been talking for the last couple months here. We're in week 4. Last month or so, we've been talking about all the times people want to kill Jesus, right? That when Jesus gets killed, Jesus is finally killed. He's killed, and it's something that happens, at the end of his ministry. It could have happened at any point. Like his first sermon, we read, somebody tries to kill him. We talked about that a few weeks ago. Everybody wants to kill Jesus. It happens here. But there's something really, really vital, I think, that we need to see here. Who it was that was trying to kill Jesus? You think, well, it's the religious leaders. It's not quite specific enough. You see, when John writes the story, he records that there were religious leaders who were there, and they saw all this. And they went and argued with him about what he thought he was doing, right? Like, who gave you the authority to do this? That's their question. It's not even so much like they sort of granted that, okay, fine. But like the money thing was not great. But who gave you the right to do this is what we read in John. In Matthew, it's similar. It's a whole thing. They're angry about what happens, but it's not, they don't try to kill him. In neither John nor Matthew, anybody tries to kill Jesus. In Luke, hilariously, he doesn't record that at all. He records that it happens, and then it's later on that people want to kill Jesus. So that's a whole other conversation. It's only Mark that tells us that directly because of the clearing of the temple, people wanted to kill Jesus. But it's not the same people that we read about in John or in Matthew. This is when the leading priests and teachers of religious law heard what Jesus had done. They heard about what he had done. Somebody told them, hey, Jesus did this. He made a whip. He turned over tables. He got rid of the animals. And they said, well, we got to kill him. It's the people who heard about him that wanted him dead, which is a fancy way of saying the people who were there didn't, at least so far as we read in the Gospels. The people who were there, do not get me wrong, were not happy with Jesus. They argue with him. They don't like it. They're upset. But they're not here to kill him. They're here to argue with him. And we can have all sorts of arguments. Arguing with somebody, asking how dare you, what authority do you have? That is a far cry from killing Jesus, from wanting him dead. And yet here is, in Mark, the people who heard about it, meaning the people who did not witness it with their own eyes. They are the ones who want Jesus dead. And I have to ask a pretty basic question. Why? Why do the people who watch scary Jesus with a whip, getting rid of all the animals, turning over the tables, why do they get angry, but don't say that dude's gots to go? And then the people who hear about it later are like, oh, we got to kill that guy. What's the disconnect? Now, look, I don't know that I have a great answer for this. I have an answer. And I think it's that the religious leaders may have accidentally done what Jesus was teaching. It's always fun when you're a Christian and you're like, hey, you're trying to do the right thing and you don't get it done. But sometimes, like, you didn't even mean to and you just happen to stumble into something. I think the religious leaders might have happened to have stumbled into something. This is what we read in the gospel according to Matthew. Something that Jesus said that is wildly important. This is what we read. It says, beware of false prophets who come disguised as harmless sheep, but are really vicious wolves. You can identify them by their fruit. That is, the way that they act. Can you pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? A good tree produces good fruit, and a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. Jesus teaches that when we go about evaluating anything in life, that a really, really good way of looking at things is what are the consequences? What is the consequence of what happens? If somebody believes something, and then the consequence is a bunch of people die, that's not good. It's probably a bad belief. Right? Like we all have examples of that, right? If somebody does something and you're like, it's fine, but then people are hurt by that, well, it's probably not fine then. If we're taking Jesus seriously, an extremely good way to evaluate. Look, there's a million voices in this world. There's so many ethical people like screaming, oh, we're right and they're wrong. And one of the best ways we can evaluate the way that people are and the way that beliefs are and the way that teachings are is just look at the end result. What is the fruit on that tree? Are people more loving and gracious and kind because people are teaching this? Or are people more hateful and awful because people are teaching this? Does this thing that seems good at first, does it end well? Or does it not? Jesus teaches us to look at things like that. A good tree produces good fruit. We can tell what kind of tree it is by what kind of fruit it is. I wonder if the disconnect between the people who witnessed Jesus doing this and the disconnect between the people who didn't witness it is because one group saw the fruit and the other ones didn't. Look, if we evaluate the four gospels and we look at what we read happens, Jesus cleanses the temple. That's just part of the story. After that, having gotten rid of the things that are barriers to God, people showed up who didn't normally show up. Children who normally wouldn't be welcome without a coin in their hand are there, and they're singing, they're worshiping. Poor people who couldn't afford to buy the animal and they couldn't afford to change the money, they were able to be there. Disabled people can't walk, people can't see, show up, and suddenly Jesus, with nothing else going on, it's quiet. It doesn't smell like a cow. Like all these things are happening. Suddenly, all this stuff, like they show up, and Jesus is healing people. In other words, there's all sorts of good fruit. And understand, the religious leaders argue with it. I'm not pretending the religious leaders were happy. But it's really hard when you witness like a blind person being given their sight. It's really hard to argue with that. It's really hard when the temple is meant for everybody, when everyone shows up to be like, whoa, we've done something wrong. Like they did it. They weren't happy. But there's a difference between not being happy and wanting him dead. Big, big difference. I actually wonder, I'm going to contradict myself here. Jesus was tough. Of course he was. But I wonder if some of the reason why no one stopped Jesus was because every single person in that building wanted to do what Jesus was doing. I wonder if the temple guard looked at this situation and said, we have made a mistake. And the Romans look at this and say, guys, we love printing money, but we don't do this in our temples. Like, we will conquer the world for profit, but this is not what we do. There's lines we won't cross. I wonder if nobody stopped him because everybody wanted to do it themselves. And here's Jesus with the guts to just go ahead. I don't know. Who knows? But the fact is, the people who witnessed Jesus argued with him, may or may not have liked it, but they did not want him dead. The people who heard it, the only real difference is that they didn't see the fruit on the tree. And so, whereas people who witnessed it can't really argue that the fruit is good, so the tree is not horrible, these guys don't see the fruit. And so they can just argue that the tree is terrible. All they hear is this violent, rebelling guy who is messing up our way of life. It's easier, I think, when you've seen it to believe it. That's the whole story of Thomas, right? Like, Thomas is all like, hey, if you show me that you're actually Jesus back from the dead, I'll believe. And then Jesus is like, okay, I will, but people are blessed if that's not what they are, right? It's easier to believe in something that you see. Like, it's just easier. But the fact of the matter is this: the reason this conversation is so important, it's not because of the temple, like, it's not because of the Roman, it's because of this. When I say the vast majority of people haven't met Jesus, I mean us. If Jesus was literally in this room right now, none of us would recognize that that's Jesus. Nobody knows what Jesus looks like. We know what, like, the European painters of the 15th century painted. We know what the senior picture looks like. That definitely doesn't look like him. We don't know what this guy looks like. We've never met him. We've never hung out with him. We have read secondhand accounts of who he is. That's it. And that doesn't mean that we can't have faith. It doesn't mean we can't believe or follow. Understand, outside of 500 to 600 people who were witnesses to the resurrection, every human person since that moment has had to take this Christian message on faith. Okay? So there's the 500 or 600 people, no excuse, they actually saw him. But everybody else, we have to kind of take this on faith. So the question is, if that's the way that it is, how do we judge correctly? Because here's the thing that nobody wants to say. A lot of people who are not religious, a lot of people who are atheists, it's not because they don't know. They've read, they've heard, they've seen people, they've whatever, It's possible, just like the people of the temple, to hear about Jesus and say, that's not for me. It's also possible to hear about Jesus and say, that is for me. The question is, what is the difference? If we go back to the Roman centurion, why does he ask Jesus to heal his slave? Well, not only does he believe that Jesus can, but he believes Jesus wants to. He believes that Jesus is not just capable, but that he is willing. Why does he believe that? Because he's met people who have shown him this is the sort of guy he is. And we see that all throughout the Gospels. Jesus healing all sorts of people. Jesus does it because he feels like it. It made him happy. If Jesus was healing people, we get this messed up all the time. People think, oh, Jesus heals people because he wants people to believe in him. Nobody believed in him because people were healed. Like, look, it's not what I mean, maybe, it sounds nice, but it's not what happened. Like, if that was the case, right, like everywhere he went that he healed somebody, just everybody would be like, all right, we're good. That's not what happens at all. In fact, sometimes dramatically, Jesus heals people, and that makes people not believe in him. We'll get to that story in 2 weeks. So why does Jesus heal people? Because Jesus loves people. It's just that simple. He sees people in need and he says, man, I can help them. And so he does. What we need to understand is that the fruit of what Jesus does, if we break down, okay, what was the result of Jesus' ministry? The immediate results of Jesus' ministry, we have things like hungry people being fed, disabled people being healed, communities that are divided being united. We see lots and lots and lots of good things. Excluded people being included. Keep going. Everything Jesus does is good. And then, that's just what he does when he's here. Then, what's the cross about? Well, the cross defeats Satan. It frees us from sin and death. It gives us new life. It saves the world. Jesus raises from the dead, defeating our greatest enemy, making it so that we don't die, we simply go on living after death. Guys, all of that's great. The results of Jesus' ministry are incredible. And if we're doing what he said, right? If we're judging a tree by its fruit, and we look at his actions, but not just his actions, but the results of those actions, we conclude that Jesus must be good. And of course, that's not a slam dunk. Of course, this is always so complicated. But sometimes as Christians, I think it's hard to wrap our heads around just exactly where we fit in any of this. You know, life gets really, really rough, and we wonder, man, where is God? What's going on? We look in the world and we say, where's God here? You know, we see, wars, and we see, governments and nations, and we see, tragedies, and we just want, what's going on? And it can be very easy to question, well, what are we even doing here? What's the point? And I think it's in those moments when we need to remember that even Jesus' enemies, when they saw the fruit of what he did, didn't want him dead. It was folks who were not looking at the fruit. It was folks who didn't see the picture of the consequences and not just the actions. And for us, we need to focus on the consequences of Jesus' ministry, the fruit on the tree. And when we do that, it doesn't fix stuff. Heavens no. But it does give us hope. And it does give us a reason to believe and to trust that there is something bigger, that history is moving towards something better, that our lives are moving towards something better, and that at the end of the day, if nothing else, the one that we believe in is one who truly loves us and truly cares, because he is truly, truly good. This morning, we're in our fourth week of our series called Wanted. All there is people who wanted Jesus dead. As we talk about the folks who heard about Jesus doing something and wanted him dead. This is our lesson. Our fourth lesson from Wanted goes like this. All of Jesus' fruit is good, and so we can trust him even when we don't see him. All of Jesus' fruit is good, and so we can trust in him even when we don't see him. We're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation each and every week. The Bible teaches that we're supposed to repent and be baptized. That's how we enter into this relationship with Christ. That's how we enter into this kingdom of God. It sounds like two things. It's really just one. Repentance, we're called to be changeable, to turn our backs on who we used to be and to focus on Christ and to do that. In baptism, it's a picture of us aligning ourselves. Just as Christ is dead, buried, and raised, we are dead, buried, and raised. And we align ourselves with Christ, and that is who we are and what we do. We got a nice warm baptistry. All sorts of folks can do it. Let's talk. Very immersed believer in Christ. We're looking for a perfect church home. It's not here, but we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up while we do it. And we want to be people who focus on the fruit of Christ, the consequences of Christ, what he has done. And in a world that is very, very difficult to realize that he is worth trusting no matter what. As we stand,